Hello everyone, and welcome to your complete and ultimate NEUVILLETTE guide. I've been testing him extensively over the last few days, and have been enjoying playing him so far, and this video is to hopefully guide any current or future NEUVILLETTE owners on how to roughly build and play him. As usual, my video will cover all of the following in order: general playstyle, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, Constellation Overview, and an Abyss 12 showcase with multiple teams, all in an as condensed manner as possible. My own personal NEUVILLETTE is C0R1, but his artifact quality is not actually that good, as I haven't farmed the new sets very much, so just keep that in mind that my NEUVILLETTE is not as strong as I would like. But with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into the guide. NEUVILLETTE is an on-field DPS who relies on his charge attack to be both a main DPS or a driver for other reactions. He's a unique catalyst character who has massive range and excels in both AoE and single target scenarios, thanks to the way his charge attack hits enemies, as well as its high personal damage. NEUVILLETTE's biggest strength is in his enormous range. His charge attack is very far-reaching and hits multiple times. The AoE is pretty good too, and it hits through physical constructs made by both enemies and yourself, making it one of the more unique attacks in the game, and he has a very interesting way to play in AoE scenarios that I'll get to later. Team building is one of NEUVILLETTE's more difficult parts of his playstyle though. He's someone who really wants reactions for his personal damage, but also needs a strong shielder at C0 since you really want him to not get interrupted during his charge attack. Additionally, he does also demand quite a bit of field time, and so he pairs best with off-field damage dealers or reaction proccers. He's also a fully HP scaling character, which means attack buffers such as Bennett and Sarah are not very helpful to him. But overall, NEUVILLETTE's kit, despite some confusing parts, is actually pretty simple to play. You set up your Hydro-based reactions, then start blasting your laser with NEUVILLETTE. While he's not strictly a Hypercarry character per se, he has very strong personal damage and can fit into many teams thanks to just being Hydro, arguably the best element in the game right now. Even in reaction-based teams, NEUVILLETTE will usually still be the biggest or at least second biggest damage contributor to the team, though he does have some potential team restrictions which we'll get to later.
I will have order. Crumble.
Starting with the most important part of NEUVILLETTE's kit, his normal attack talent. NEUVILLETTE's normal and regular charge attacks are nothing special. The former does 3 hits of Hydro damage, while the latter does 1 small Hydro blast that consumes a standard 50 stamina. These attacks are attack scaling, and because the rest of NEUVILLETTE's kit is HP scaling, these do not do very much damage. Then on to his special charge attack, Equitable Judgment. Without any source water droplets on the field, you will need to hold your charge attack for 4 seconds for it to fully charge. While charging, NEUVILLETTE will float off the ground and you will still have lateral mobility while charging, which means you can float over water. Once fully charged, NEUVILLETTE will fire off a massive water laser that lasts around 3 to 4 seconds, which consumes no stamina. The laser can hit an enemy a maximum of 8 times and has an internal damage tick cooldown of 0.4 seconds per enemy. While outputting his laser, NEUVILLETTE will drain his HP as stated here until he is below 50% HP, which makes him a big beneficiary of the Maritrosi Hunter set. Also, you cannot swap characters during this charge attack. You will need to dash or jump cancel it early before being able to swap him out. You can also cancel it by either casting his skill or burst. The beam has standard ICD, meaning it applies Hydro once every 3 hits or 2.5 seconds. The laser scaling is quite high, dealing 13% of its max HP per tick at talent level 9, and its standard ICD application combined with its fast ticks makes him actually a pretty good reaction driver. However, it has a long ramp up time, so the way to circumvent this is to have NEUVILLETTE absorb source water droplets, or as I like to call it, blue balls. But I'm not going to keep calling it that so YouTube does not demonetize this video. As stated here, droplets generated by NEUVILLETTE's skill, burst, or even other characters like Hydro MC can be absorbed to cut down the charging time of his charge attack. Up to a maximum of 3 droplets can be absorbed, with each cutting down the charging time by about 1 second, and it will automatically be done so within a set AoE once you start performing the charge attack. It will then take only 1 second to fully charge, making this the way to efficiently deal damage. You should never fully charge without droplets on the field. Droplets will also heal NEUVILLETTE for a significant amount each. Basically, just use his burst or skill to generate droplets first before actually using his charge attack. I also want to just very briefly talk about the spin to win strategy that you may have seen on Twitter or in some YouTube videos. Yes, it's a legitimate strat that works if you have a high DPI mouse. Whether this will get patched or not, I can't really be sure, but I will link a really good video by iWinToLose where he explains this exploit. I call it an exploit, but it's like a strategy of sorts But this strat isn't actually that good everywhere. It's good when you have multiple spread out enemies like in the current Abyss 9, but in a surprisingly large number of scenarios, this strat is not actually that effective. It's also only doable for PC players, and even then, it's a very uncomfortable way to play. I just don't recommend using this method much, and if this spin to win strategy gets patched, I will update you guys in a pinned comment below. Ooh, okay, that was a lot to cover. Anyways, no matter the playstyle, this talent should be your highest priority to level, as his charge attack makes up the majority of Neuvillette's damage. For his elemental skill, it's pretty simple. Neuvillette will deal 2 instances of hydro damage, the first one scaling off his HP, and the second one scaling off his attack stat. However, the second hit deals Pneuma damage, which can be useful for disabling certain fontaine enemies. Upon hitting an enemy, 3 droplets will also be created. So this skill's main purpose is to allow you to instantly fire off a charge attack laser while also generating energy for his burst. Speaking of which, this skill generates 3 to 4 hydro particles when it hits an enemy. It also has an okay cooldown of 12 seconds, but overall, this skill isn't a big damage contributor to his kit. Then onto his burst. This one deals 1 big instance of hydro damage, then 2 smaller hits. All hits scale off his HP, as stated here, but more importantly, it generates 6 droplets for you to immediately cast 2 charge attacks in quick succession. Because droplets last 15 seconds, I actually recommend casting this at the start of the rotation first, swapping to your team members to react with hydro for his A1, then swapping back to Neuvillette last to fire off the 2 or 3 lasers in succession. This burst has an okay damage scaling and a moderately high 70 energy cost, so it doesn't really make up a ton of damage. This talent and his skill talent can be leveled equally, but aren't that important. Then for passive talents, Neuvillette's A1 is an integral part of his kit. As stated here, when any party member causes a hydro-related reaction, such as bloom, vaporize, freeze, electrocharge, or hydro swirl, etc., Neuvillette will gain a percentage damage bonus to his laser up to a maximum of 3 stacks. But these stacks are calculated independently, so triggering the same reaction twice will not give you another stack. It will just refresh the one you currently have. To take full advantage of this passive, you will need to trigger 3 different reactions. In my team's case, I can trigger Hydro Crystallize with Zhongli, Swirl with Kazuha, and Electrocharge with Fischl. This is all up to you to decide, but while this passive is very strong, you don't have to force yourself to proc all 3 reactions if your team doesn't allow it. For example, in Nilou Bloom teams, you'll only be able to get 1 stack at C0, which is perfectly fine. Neuvillette will do less personal damage, but if it's worth the trade-off for your team, then don't worry too much about it. And then lastly, his A4 gives him damage bonus the more HP he currently has. Because Neuvillette drains his HP pretty quickly, the benefit of this passive will slowly go down when you do his charge attack unless you also have an external healer. But to be honest, this passive is kind of whatever, don't think too hard about it. Neuvillette being an HP scaling character, his weapon options are surprisingly limited, so this list is not very exhaustive. His best in slot is obviously his signature weapon, the Tome of the Eternal Flow. This weapon gives 88% crit damage with a passive that increases his HP, charge attack damage, and even offers flat energy refund for better burst uptime. This weapon is actually kinda crazy and is pretty far ahead of any other option, and is actually one of the better performing signature weapons on the roster, at least compared to its other options. So if you want to maximize Neuvillette's personal damage, I actually do recommend pulling for this now since it's paired with the Staff of Homer, which is a obviously really good weapon. But then after that, I actually don't really recommend any other 5-star weapons. The main reasons being that they just don't perform as well and are oftentimes worse than the 4 stars that I'm about to mention. Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds is the only one that I'd say is usable, but even then it's just not great. Just use the 4-star ones I'm about to say. The next best option is the Sacrificial Jade, which I don't currently have because I didn't redeem this in the last Battle Pass. But yes, this is a paid weapon from the Battle Pass, making it not really accessible to everyone, but this is a fantastic weapon for Neuvillette, having a crit substat, while also having HP % in its substat. The only caveat with this weapon is that it's a little restrictive in terms of rotations, and you may not be able to fully take advantage of this passive with full uptime. Still though, if you do buy the Battle Pass, then this weapon is pretty good. And then lastly, for the F2P gamers out there, the Prototype Amber is a fantastic free craftable option. It has quite a lot of HP % in its substat, and a decent passive that regenerates energy for Neuvillette for better burst uptime. If you don't have either his signature weapon or the Sacrificial Jade, then just use this, it's like way more than good enough. But yeah, his weapon options really aren't very wide. I think this might be the smallest pool of weapon recommendations I've ever given in a guide, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that NEUVILLETTE's HP scaling and unique kit makes his selection smaller than other characters. Just be thankful that the prototype Amber exists and is a free craftable option.
Let's light it up!
Settle down.
For artifact stats, NEUVILLETTE only has two main stats to worry about, his HP and his crit. Firstly, I want to talk about his crit. If you are using the Marechaussee Hunter, which I'm sure most of you are, you'll get a lot of free crit rate from the set bonus, which allows you to reallocate a ton of other stats. For those using this set, I recommend having at the very minimum 40% crit rate, which is pretty easy to get and gives you an effective 76% crit rate. As you can see, my crit rate is pretty high at 62%, which gives me an effective 98% crit rate. I personally always favor having a high crit rate, but it all comes down to your stat balance. If you don't use the Marechaussee Hunter set, which I'm sure is not that many of you, but some of you might not be using it just because you haven't farmed the set, you should aim for at least 75% crit rate, which is obviously much harder to farm for, but NEUVILLETTE is a character that really likes having high crit, just like most other DPSs in the game. This is why I highly recommend against using any other set, but just do what you will with what you have. As for how much crit damage you need, well, there's no real answer to that. But if you have his signature weapon, which gives a lot of crit damage, I will say that you might want to focus on more HP percent substats instead of crit damage ones, especially if you have over 250% crit damage already. For his HP, similar to his crit damage stat, there's no real answer. But I think having at least 30,000 is a good baseline as a minimum, but obviously there are those players who have even more than 45,000 HP. It just all comes down to your stat balancing, seeing what you have, and whether your crit is good or not. And then finally, is energy recharge important? I personally don't find it super important for NEUVILLETTE, but obviously having better burst uptime allows you to cast your charge attack more easily. If you don't have a signature weapon or use the prototype Amber, having up to 130% ER is pretty good. But in my own gameplay, I haven't found his burst to be that essential to prioritize it. And then for your actual artifact stats, your sands should always be HP percent, your goblet should generally be hydro damage bonus, and then your circlet should be crit. But because we don't really have HP buffers in the game, NEUVILLETTE rarely receives external buffs. In this case, it actually allows you to run either an HP percent goblet or HP percent circlet, but only if you can balance out the stats properly. I'd say an HP percent goblet isn't really advised, but having an HP percent circlet is definitely viable if you have a signature weapon and have a good enough crit rate. For his artifact set recommendations, his uncontested best option is going to be the Marechaussee Hunter. It gives 36% crit rate in its passive that is very easily triggered thanks to NEUVILLETTE's pretty quick HP drain. Having so much crit offset for you allows you to build other stats like HP, ER, and crit damage. If you haven't already, I highly recommend farming this set for him. His second best option is going to be the Heart of Depth, which gives hydro damage and grants 30% charge attack damage. This is a really good second place, though I can't imagine like a lot of people having insanely good Heart of Depth artifact pieces just lying around. The domain is also not very efficient to farm or strongbox for, so only use this if you already have a decent full set or don't have a good 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter. A slightly worse option would be the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop, which is in a pretty similar boat to Heart of Depth, giving charge attack damage but nothing much else going for it. And then of course you can mix and match your sets around, but all the mix options are so much worse than the 4-piece sets mentioned that honestly just farm for the Marechaussee Hunter. Like seriously, just farm for the set. Okay, for teams, NEUVILLETTE is pretty flexible, but I will say that I don't think he's particularly free-to-play friendly in this aspect. At C0, you're almost always going to want some form of super armor, with the best option obviously being Zhongli. It's not so much about the shield strength, since characters like Layla or Kirara are almost as good in that aspect, but it's more so the shield uptime. Because Zhongli's shield lasts so long, you often don't even have to worry about the shield's duration running out while you are using your charge attack. Obviously, C1 NEUVILLETTE owners won't have this problem, but those who don't have it will greatly benefit from putting Zhongli in the party. My personal favorite team that I've been playing is this one, with Kazuha, Fischl, and Zhongli. Fischl just contributes a ton of damage thanks to her C6, and also takes up very little field time. This is why Fischl is so much better than someone like Yaemiko, who takes up a ton of field time, or Beidou, who has very bad energy issues when she's alone. Kazuha is just really good for grouping and damage buffing in general, just the typical Kazuha stuff, you know. If you have C1 NEUVILLETTE, you can remove Zhongli and put in a more offensive character, such as Mona or even Beidou. On the other hand, another team that will work really well is also Hyperbloom. You can use Nahida or DMC as the Dendro slot, and then your Electro slot can be Raiden or Cookie Shinobu. Though if you already have a shielder, Raiden is going to fare much better than Cookie. Personally, I'm actually not a fan of NEUVILLETTE Hyperbloom. It's just good because Hyperbloom is good, but I find the previous team much more fun to play. I also think Hyperbloom is better carried by other DPSs such as El Haytham. You can also play him in a Nilou team if you have her, but obviously you won't be taking advantage of his A1 passive. In something like a Nilou team, a shielder like Kirara is also going to be very helpful. Then for those of you who don't have many 5 stars, unfortunately your F2P options are kind of limited. Fisher will definitely be very much recommended for the more normal DPS teams, then someone like Layla or Sucrose can substitute Zhongli and Kazuha. It's quite hard to cook up an F2P team for him since so many of them want at least another 5 star, but you can just work with what you have first, then work your way up after getting certain other characters. For constellations, NEUVILLETTE is not really constellation dependent, but he does have some pretty good early ones. Constellation 1. This gives NEUVILLETTE super armor during his charge attack, which means he no longer needs to worry about getting interrupted and won't require a shielder anymore. It also grants him 1 stack of his A1 immediately, just making it easier to maximize. This constellation just serves to allow you to run a more offensive character slot now, which is obviously really good. However, while this constellation can be really tempting, I think if you're a Zhongli owner and already plan to play them together, this constellation isn't like amazingly valuable. It's more so a flexibility and quality of life upgrade. Constellation 2, pretty straightforward. It gives NEUVILLETTE more crit damage the more stacks of his A1 he has, and it's pretty easy to hit the cap of 42% here. Constellation 3 and 5 are both talent increases, but C3, unlike normal, is actually an increase to his normal attack talent, which is very valuable for him and also very uncommon. I don't actually know if any other character in the game has increases to their normal attack talent via constellations, so if there is, feel free to let me know in the comments. Constellation 4. This grants droplets once NEUVILLETTE is healed, which is not really helpful since you only want 3 droplets at a time anyways, so this constellation doesn't really do anything unless you have C6. And then speaking of C6, this constellation extends his charge attack duration by 1 second per droplet he absorbs, since he will now absorb all the droplets in the field rather than only 3 at a time. It also deals a decent amount of additional damage, though this constellation is overall a pro and a con. The main con being that giving NEUVILLETTE more field time for a single charge attack cycle isn't necessarily a good thing, especially if you play with characters like Kazuha, whose A4 and VV buffs don't last that long. I think this constellation will highly depend on your teammates and playstyle, but its extra damage is extra damage, so it's always welcome. So overall, NEUVILLETTE's constellations are fairly decent, but they are not really necessary and are very straightforward, nor do they really change his place in the meta. He's still very solid as C0, and I think his C1 is probably the best stopping point for any of those low spenders out there, thanks to its extra flexibility. And finally, onto the Abyss Showcase. I'll be using my NEUVILLETTE in 3 different teams on the top half of the 4.0 Abyss 12.
Let the might be humble. As you wish me. Bow your head. Be sanctified.
I summon. Stay put.
Silence. This is order. Crumble. Bow your head. Let the mighty be humble.
Grow. Get with me.
Gallop.
Make yourselves a room.
Solidify.
The bond is strong. Yep. Just stay clear.
Silence.
with me! The show's only just begun!
Settle down. This is order. Quake.
Fallen leaves, adorn my night!
As you wish. Be sanctified.
Thank you everyone for watching this Neuvillette guide. I hope it was helpful, and I wish everyone the best of luck building him. May all Neuvillette wanters be Neuvillette havers. Do check out twitch.tv/DukC as well, where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.